Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at sexual behaviors across the entire lifespan.
Across the entire lifespan, yeah.
And we've got a couple of really interesting research articles to dig into.
Yes, we do.
And I think some of the findings might surprise you.
I think they will. Well, the first article we are going to be looking at is titled Sexual Behavior in the United States, Results from a National Probability Sample of Men and Women Ages 14-94.
Wow. Okay, so 14 to 94.
14 to 94. It's a big range, and it was published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine.
Okay.
And it really is, like you were saying, it's a deep dive, the lifespan, it's all there. Yeah. And having this nationally representative sample is incredibly valuable. It's not just like we're talking about a small group of college students or something.
Right.
This is, across the U.S., and they made sure to include lots of different kinds of people in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, where they live, sexual orientation, the whole 9 yards, right? Absolutely. Over 5,800 people took part in this online survey.
Wow.
Through knowledge networks. So we can be pretty confident that what we're seeing here really reflects what's happening out there in the U.S.
Yeah, that's great. That makes this data a lot more meaningful.
It does. And speaking of meaningful, one of the findings that really jumped out at the researchers was that more people had engaged in same-sex sexual behavior at some point than actually identify as homosexual or bisexual. Which I think, kind of makes you think. It suggests that maybe our sexual identities and our behaviors, they're not always so fixed, right? Maybe there's more fluidity there than we often assume.
Yeah. That's really interesting. It makes you wonder, how often are we making assumptions about people's experiences without even realizing it?
Yeah. It's something to consider, for sure.
Absolutely. So let's move on to something that's often seen as a solo act, I guess you could say, which is masturbation.
Masturbation, yeah.
I got to admit, I was surprised to see that, according to this study, masturbation is actually more common than partnered sexual activity during both adolescence and older age.
Interesting, huh?
Yeah, like 70 and above.
It is interesting. But when you think about it, adolescence, maybe there's less opportunity for partnered sexual activity. And then older age, it could be health changes.
Yeah.
Relationship status, like they're widowed. Or maybe their desires are just changing.
Yeah, I mean, people's interest in sex doesn't just disappear as they age.
No.
It just might take on different forms.
Right, exactly.
It's a good reminder that sexuality is a lifelong journey,
Absolutely. And speaking of different forms, this study, they didn't hold back. They really looked at a whole bunch of different partnered sexual behaviors.
Yeah. You could say they left no stone unturned.
They did not. They looked at things like the frequency of different activities across different age groups. They were very thorough.
So give us some of the highlights. What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Well, for instance, in the past year, over half of both men and women between the ages of 18 and 49 reported engaging in oral sex.
Okay.
And this might surprise some people, but over 20% of men ages 25-49 and women ages 20-39 reported having anal sex in the past year.
Wow, that's higher than I would guessed.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder not to make assumptions, I guess, about what other people are doing.
Absolutely. Everyone's experiences are unique.
Absolutely. So, I don't know, for me, what's striking me so far is how much our own personal assumptions about what's normal can actually be pretty different from what the data shows us.
Yeah.
We might think certain things are more common or less common than they actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so important to have these large-scale studies,
Did it?
to really challenge our preconceived notions and broaden our understanding of human sexuality.
I couldn't agree more. It's about going beyond anecdotes and personal experience and getting that bigger picture. And to get even deeper into that, let's bring in our second source, which focuses specifically on youth sexual activity.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
This is a research brief called Factors Influencing Youth Sexual Activity, Conceptual Models for Sexual Risk Avoidance and Cessation.
Okay.
What's interesting about this one is it doesn't just look at avoiding sexual risk behaviors.
Okay.
It also looks at what influences young people to cease certain behaviors. So they might have been doing something and then stopped.
Right.
So it's looking at both sides of that coin.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. It acknowledges that, some young people will choose to abstain from sex, while others might be sexually active and then decide to change their behaviors later on.
Exactly. And to understand those decisions, they break things down into 3 different levels of influence.
Okay.
Environmental, interpersonal, and individual.
So it's kind of like layers of an onion almost, with the individual at the core.
That's a good way to think about it. And this framework helps us see how many different factors are at play.
Yeah. So give us some concrete examples, like what are some of the specific factors that might be at each level?
Sure. At the environmental level, we might look at socioeconomic status.
Okay.
For example, they found that youth from families with higher incomes and more parental education tended to delay having sex for the first time.
That makes sense. More resources usually means better access to education and support systems.
Right.
What about at the interpersonal level?
That's where things get interesting. They found that higher self-esteem in young people was linked to earlier sexual initiation.
Oh, really? I would thought higher self-esteem would mean being more confident about setting boundaries and making healthy choices.
You would, and that's what makes this finding so interesting. It could be that they're just more comfortable exploring their sexuality,
Okay.
or they see themselves as more mature. It kind of challenges some of our assumptions, right?
Yeah, definitely makes you think. Human behavior, it's not always straightforward.
It's not.
For folks listening out there who work with young people or are parents, I'm really curious to know what you think about this. Do these findings resonate with you or what you've seen?
I mean, it's a good exercise to think about these factors and how they might have shaped our own development, too.
Right, yeah, thinking back to our own teenage years, for sure.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important point that one of the articles brought up.
Okay.
How we measure sexual behavior actually matters a lot.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. Like the way we collect data and analyze it, that can really shape our understanding of things, right?
Absolutely. One key difference that this article pointed out is between what they called count data and relative frequency.
Okay, break that down for us. What's the difference there?
So count data is basically just a raw count.
Okay.
Like how many times something happened. So how many sexual encounters someone has had.
Got it.
Relative frequency takes those counts and expresses them as percentages or proportions.
Oh, okay. So like if someone's had 10 sexual encounters and used a condom 5 times, that's a 50% condom use rate.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's the catch. The article argues that if we only focus on relative frequency, we might miss some important information about risks.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So imagine we have two people.
Okay.
Person A has had 2 sexual encounters and used a condom once. So 50% condom use.
Okay.
Person B has had 100 encounters and used a condom 50 times. Also 50% condom use.
Right.
But if we look at the raw numbers, person A has only had 1 instance of unprotected sex, while person B has had 50.
Right.
That's a huge difference in terms of potential risks.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great example. Focusing only on percentages could really give a false sense of security.
Exactly. It highlights why we have to look at both the count data and the relative frequency, especially when we're dealing with behaviors that can have serious consequences for health.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's not just about how often something happens, but also the total number of times it's happened.
Exactly. And that nuance is what makes the study of sexual behavior so fascinating, but also really challenging.
Absolutely.
And it's something we'll keep exploring as we continue this deep dive.
So as we continue to kind of dig into all these different sexual behaviors across the lifespan, I think it's worth going back to that second article about youth sexual activity. One thing that really struck me was how much emphasis they put on, like understanding the context around these behaviors. It's not just about whether or not a young person is having sex. It's about all the stuff that influences their decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the study did a great job of showing that, they talked about those individual factors like self-esteem or impulsivity,
Right.
but they really emphasized how those traits, they play out differently depending on a young person's social environment,
Absolutely. So a young person who's like facing pressure from peers or a partner might make different choices than someone who's got like really solid support systems, right?
Exactly, exactly. And I think it also matters, what kind of community they're growing up in. Like, do they have access to resources, accurate information? All that plays a role.
Right. So it's not as simple as just saying make good choices, make bad choices,
Right.
There's a lot more nuance to it.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so crucial to really try to understand the complexity of what these young people are going through. Like, we can't just, oversimplify it. We need to understand all the different factors if we really want to support them in making healthy decisions.
Yeah. And speaking of support, I think I remember reading in that study about the importance of communication between parents and kids when it comes to sex and relationships, like having those open conversations.
Oh, yeah. The sex talk.
Exactly.
Always a fun one.
Right. But what was interesting was that the study actually found that when parents have these open and honest conversations with their kids before they become sexually active, it can actually help delay that sexual initiation.
It makes sense when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
If you can create a space where young people feel comfortable asking questions and getting accurate information without feeling judged, that can make a big difference.
It's not about giving them one big lecture and then never talking about it again.
No, absolutely not.
It's about having those ongoing conversations, as kids grow and develop. So for our listeners out there, I'm actually really curious, what are your thoughts about talking to young people about sex? Was that something that was openly discussed in your family growing up, or was it more of a taboo topic?
Right. Or if you're a parent now, or if you work with youth, how do you approach those conversations?
Exactly. Because, it can be a tough subject to talk about, but it's so important, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It's essential for young people's well-being.
So, yeah, thinking more broadly, both of these articles we've been looking at, they really just highlight the incredible diversity of human sexual experience. There's no one right way to be sexual, right?
Right.
What's normal or acceptable can be so different depending on your culture, your age, individual preferences, so many factors.
Yeah. And even within these studies, it's important to remember that, we're looking at data, right?
Right.
But each data point is a real person.
Yeah.
With their own story, their own desires, and their own experiences.
And that complexity, I think, is what makes it so fascinating to study.
It does.
And speaking of studying, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier, which is the importance of recognizing the limitations of data. Even with a large, nationally representative sample like the one in that first article, we're not going to have all the answers, right?
Oh, definitely not. I mean, we always have to be mindful of how we ask the questions,
Yeah.
how we collect the data, and even how societal norms or biases can sneak in and shape our findings.
One of the articles mentioned how some older studies, they didn't even ask about the gender of the partners for oral sex. So, we really don't know for sure how common same-sex or other sex oral sex was back then. Because they just didn't collect that information.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder that data can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
But we have to be critical consumers of that information, We have to understand the context in which it was collected.
Absolutely. So what can our listeners do to be more, I guess, savvy consumers of this type of research?
Well, I think the key is to pay attention to the methodology,
Okay.
How was the data collected? Who was included in the sample? What types of questions were asked? Those are the things you want to be looking at.
And be wary of any headlines that make sweeping generalizations or try to oversimplify the findings, right?
Yeah. Remember, research is a process. It's ongoing.
Yeah.
We're always asking new questions, challenging old assumptions.
Absolutely. Right.
It's about refining our understanding.
It's not just about taking the numbers at face value.
Right.
It's about digging deeper, considering all the factors that might be at play. Well, this has been a really insightful discussion so far. We've covered a lot of ground, but we're not done yet. There's still so much more to explore. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we're going to get into some of the, I guess you could say the more technical stuff, the statistical aspects of this kind of research.
The fun stuff.
Yeah, the fun stuff. It might sound intimidating, but trust me, it's fascinating. Welcome back to the deep dive.
So we're now in the final part of our exploration of sexual behaviors throughout life. And in this last part, we're going to tackle something that might sound a little intimidating at first, the statistical side of things. The numbers. But don't worry, we'll try to make it as painless as possible.
Yeah,
right?
We will. And, it's true that some of the methods used in this area can get pretty complicated. But even if you're not a statistician, understanding the basics can help you be a more critical reader of research. Right. Because it's all about understanding that even numbers can be influenced by a lot of different factors.
Exactly.
They're not just objective truth.
Right.
So one of the articles that we've been talking about, it actually went into quite a bit of detail about the different statistical approaches for analyzing this kind of data.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it was a lot.
It can be dense.
It was dense.
Yeah.
But one of the key takeaways I got from it was the importance of, using methods that are appropriate for the specific type of data being collected. You can't just throw any statistical model at these numbers and expect to get meaningful results, right?
Right, because a lot of traditional statistical methods, like ANOVA, they're based on this assumption that data is normally distributed.
Right.
That bell curve.
Bell curve, yeah.
But when you're dealing with count data, like the number of sexual partners someone's had or the number of times they've engaged in a specific behavior, that data, it doesn't always follow that neat bell shape.
Right, yeah, because it's not like height or weight or something.
Exactly. It tends to be skewed, you know, with a long tail to the right.
So it's kind of like you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
You need the right tool for the job.
You do. And that's where these things called generalized linear models come in. GLMs for short.
GLMs, okay.
GLMs.
Yeah, I remember seeing that term in the article.
Yeah, they're more flexible.
Right.
They can handle those different types of data distributions.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a toolbox with different wrenches, like you were saying.
Like a toolbox, yeah. Each one's designed for a specific type of data.
Okay, that makes sense. So GLMs give researchers more options, I guess, for analyzing this kind of data.
They do. It's a more nuanced approach.
Yeah.
And the article also talked about something called generalized estimating equations, or GEs.
GEs. Oh, yeah, I vaguely remember seeing that too.
GEs. Those are actually a type of GLM, and they're really useful for analyzing data that's collected over time. So what we call longitudinal data. So let's say we're studying a new sex ed program.
Okay.
And we want to see how it impacts teenagers' condom use over a couple of years.
Okay, yeah.
We're not just getting one snapshot in time. We're tracking these changes.
So instead of like a single photo, it's like a video.
Exactly.
Okay.
And with that kind of data, you have to think about the fact that, well, the measurements we're taking on the same person at different points in time, they're not independent, are they?
Right. Because their behaviors and attitudes are probably going to evolve over time.
Right.
But they're also shaped by what happened before.
Yeah, exactly. And GEs help us account for that
Okay.
connection between those repeated measurements. So we can really understand, like, the impact of the program itself.
It's like trying to figure out how much of a plant's growth is due to, like, the fertilizer we're giving it versus just how much it would have grown naturally.
Right. That's a great analogy. Yeah, it's about separating those different factors.
Okay, so GEs help us do that.
They do.
Right.
Now, are you ready for one more statistical tool? This one might sound almost too good to be true.
Hit me with it. I'm ready.
Okay. This one's called bootstrapping.
Bootstrapped.
Bootstrapping. So imagine you have a bag of marbles, different colors.
Okay.
You grab a handful, you count up the colors, and you figure out, like, the percentage of each color in that handful.
Okay.
Then you put the marbles back in the bag, and you take another handful. You'll probably get slightly different percentages each time, right?
Yeah, because you're getting a different mix of marbles each time.
Exactly.
But over many, many handfuls, you'd start to get an idea of, like, the true distribution of colors in the bag.
That's the idea behind bootstrapping.
Oh, okay.
It's like creating a bunch of mini experiments from your original data
Okay.
and seeing how much the results change.
So it's like a way to double-check your findings to see if they hold up.
It is. It helps you figure out how much uncertainty there is in your results.
Okay. So it's like acknowledging that what we find in a study is just one small piece of a much bigger picture.
Exactly. And that humility is crucial, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with something as sensitive and complex as sexual behavior.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of, I don't know, amazement and caution.
Mm-hmm.
Amazement at just how much we can learn about human sexuality through research,
Yeah.
but also caution about, the potential to misunderstand or misuse that knowledge.
It's a powerful tool, and we have to use it responsibly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that responsibility doesn't just lie with the researchers, right?
Yeah.
It's on all of us as consumers of information to be critical thinkers, to ask questions, and to have, like, thoughtful and respectful conversations about these topics.
Yeah. Keep learning, seek out diverse perspectives, and be willing to challenge your own assumptions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of sexual behaviors throughout life.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you've learned something new, and we encourage you to keep exploring these topics and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.